The weather that morning was clearly unpleasant. People bundled up in coats and scarves, trying to shield themselves from the gusts of wind accompanied by fine, prickly rain. The overcast sky, like a massive gray canvas, stretched across the horizon, preventing the sun's rays from breaking through the thick clouds. In the car, where a tense silence hung, filled with the anxiety of the moment, sat two people. What a day it is! John was the first to break the prolonged pause. No response followed. His wife, Alice, sat in the back seat, leaning against the backrest with her eyes closed. "Are you going to be able to walk?" John asked, turning to his wife. Despite the tone of his voice resembling an attempt to express concern, there was still a coldness that slipped through. "Yeah. You've got enough life in you for 5 minutes, and you're still wandering around cemeteries," Alice whispered quietly. "Pick a spot and let's get out of here." Struggling to get out of the car, she leaned against the side door, trying to maintain her balance. The world around her spun, colors flickering before her eyes like in a mysterious kaleidoscope. A wave of nausea washed over her, forcing her to involuntarily close her eyes. "Let's go. You can choose, or I won't have time. I still need to go to the notary," John said, as if oblivious to his wife's state, and walked ahead. "It's bad," Alice whispered. Her attempt to take a step ended with her falling onto the wet asphalt. At that moment, her husband gripped her hand so tightly that she nearly cried out in pain. Alice bit her lip, trying not to betray her suffering. "I don't want to," she whispered, and tears shimmered in her eyes. John, seemingly frightened that her feelings might be contagious, let go of her hand. "Well, don't look. But you still need to choose a spot. Before it's too late, and you need to make the will," he cut in. Alice squeezed her eyes shut, trying to stop the dizziness. "But why do I have to choose?" "Darling, so you realize what awaits you and don't delay with the will. Otherwise, you keep hoping for a miracle, which, you know, doesn't happen," John said with irony, and led her deeper into the cemetery along a narrow overgrown path between rows of graves. The cool wind pierced her to the bone. Alice looked around, observing the endless rows of headstones adorned with sculptures of angels and crosses. All of this evoked a deadly melancholy in her, amplifying her suffering. They stopped in front of an empty plot, fenced off with a low railing. "Sunshine," Alice was astonished by his cynicism. "Although it's true, why am I the sunshine?" "You won't need it anymore," John replied with cold indifference. Alice imagined herself lying in a grave, covered with cold earth, and became even more frightened. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. "That's natural. But we all have to go someday. And you too. It seems it will be soon. So if you want to do something good, don't forget to mention it in your will," John replied, irritation evident in his voice. "Why do you say that?" "Maybe I'll get better," a glimmer of hope flashed in Alice's eyes. "Of course, you'll get better," he muttered bitterly. "Don't kid yourself. Medicine is absolutely powerless in your case," John said coldly. After his words, Alice drooped. She felt her strength waning and understood that John was telling the truth. But Alice didn't want to leave. She desperately wanted to live, to see the sun, to feel the beating of her heart. However, it seemed her husband didn't understand this and, moreover, was eager to leave, to get away from this sorrowful place as soon as possible. His plan had worked. After such a trip to the cemetery, Alice would surely become more compliant and quickly sign the necessary papers. John got in the car and started the engine. Alice obediently settled into the back seat, afraid to say an extra word. He had become very cold towards her lately, as if he wanted her to understand everything without further explanations. John kept reminding her about the notary, as if Alice didn't already know that. After all, she had no other relatives besides her husband, so the will was just a matter of time. But he continued to press on the sore spot, insisting on its swift completion. At that moment, an elderly woman in a coat approached their car. "Excuse me, could you give me a ride to the bus stop?" "My legs are giving out," the stranger said, looking intently at Alice. "Of course, hop in," Alice replied cheerfully, making the decision for both of them. John clenched his fingers painfully on the steering wheel. "Great, now we're giving a ride to this old woman," he thought irritably to himself. Meanwhile, the elderly woman struggled to climb into the car, and Alice helped her settle in. When the stranger touched Alice's hand, she flinched and looked at her oddly. "Thank you, dear. I can see not all is lost for you yet," the grandmother whispered softly as she adjusted herself in her seat. Alice raised her eyebrows in surprise, not understanding the meaning of her words. John shot Alice an angry glance, but remained silent. For a while, a suffocating silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of the engine. Finally, the elderly passenger settled a bit and quietly addressed Alice. "I can see your fate. You are on the wrong path. Don't do what you've planned. It will only bring you misfortune." "You see what I've planned?" "What are you talking about?" Alice asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. "I see dark clouds over you. Don't let them gather over your life. Be careful," the grandmother whispered with an allegorical tone. "But I have no quarrels with anyone." "Why do you say that?" Alice pressed on. "It's not a quarrel, dear. It's something more serious. Don't do anything that threatens your happiness," the old woman whispered, glancing at the driver. "Be careful." "What should I do then?" Alice asked cautiously. "Be strong. And remember my words," the woman replied. Hearing part of their conversation, John snorted. What a crazy old woman. Clearly not all there, he thought and smirked. For Alice, however, there was nothing funny about it. She felt confused and empty. It seemed this kind old lady could see all her secrets and read her thoughts. "We're almost there. Where should I drop you off?" Alice asked the passenger a bit awkwardly. "Wherever you drop me off, that's the end of the line," John replied rudely. "Why do you have to be like that?" Alice chided him. "Alice, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to drive this old lady all over the region?" John snapped back. The stranger darkened, and a thick web of wrinkles settled on her forehead. "You should treat elderly people with more respect, young man. Age is a fickle thing, you know. It will pass before you even notice," she said quietly but firmly. John's face turned crimson with anger. "You're the one who will be flying out of here. More like you'll be ejected from the car like a cork." "Looking for free transportation," he retorted. "What do I have here, a taxi? A bus? There are no discounts here, and your pension ID won't help you." The elderly woman merely smirked. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and after a moment pulled out some strange object, extending it to Alice. "Here, dear, take this. It's a talisman against evil people and all kinds of misfortunes. Carry it, and happiness will come to you." "But I really must go now," she said. Alice carefully took the tiny object and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you. What's your name? And how do you know all this?" she asked. "You can just call me Gloria. I'm actually a fortune teller. And you don't need to know anything more." "And remember my words," the elderly woman replied, lowering her voice. "A fortune teller. Ha! She's just a charlatan. I can see through people like her. Just grease my palm, sir, and I'll tell you the whole truth. John mocked her, intentionally stopping the car right by a large puddle. Gloria shook her head and whispered something quietly, looking at John. Alice gasped, but it was too late. The grandmother found herself ankle-deep in rainwater. John, why did you do that? You could have dropped her off in a dry place. Alice exclaimed. John smirked, putting on the most innocent face he could muster. Sorry, didn't notice, he replied coldly. Alice watched the hunched figure of Gloria walk away and felt a sudden pang of sorrow. The grandmother splashed through the puddles, her old clothes getting soaked, and despite all her mysterious oddities, Alice felt a genuine sympathy for her. She gathered herself to open the door and follow her, but John quickly locked the doors, preventing her from doing so. Alice sighed heavily. Inside, she felt a growing unrest. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. Let's just go. But I think I need to think everything over again before signing the documents, Alice said softly, lowering her gaze. Think it over? Why? We've already discussed everything, John snapped irritably. No, not everything. I'm aware of my actions and don't depend on you, Alice replied firmly, recalling Gloria's words. Therefore, I have the right to my opinion and want to do what I think is right. John narrowed his eyes, looking at his wife in confusion. Oh, something new. But you know, I don't want to argue with you. We discussed this a long time ago, and now we're going to the notary to draft the will. Our business is at stake, do you understand? Am I supposed to beg on the street after you're gone? He almost shouted. Alice flinched at his voice and, looking out the window, sadly thought about how empty her life had become. Outside, the rain was drizzling, leaving streaks on the glass, and the gray, cold landscape added to her melancholy. Alice's mood was at rock bottom. John, on the other hand, felt a tremendous surge of spirits. His dream was about to come true. Alice would make a will in his favor. The rain, which had started in the morning, turned into a nasty drizzle that flooded the city like a blurred watercolor painting. The gray asphalt, glistening with moisture, stretched out like an endless ribbon, involuntarily drawing the eye. Suddenly, the car jolted and stopped in the middle of the road. Alice flinched, looking at John in fright. What is this? Are you spending all the money on your treatment again? John muttered irritably, glaring at his wife. Alice didn't want to argue, especially when he was so agitated. John, grumbling under his breath, tried to start the car again. The SUV, usually obedient and reliable, seemed to refuse to obey its owner today. This starter again. John mumbled, desperately pounding his fist on the steering wheel. Alice watched silently, realizing that the breakdown was likely not accidental. She felt the talisman lying in her pocket, which seemed to have already begun to work its magic. John shot her a worried glance. Don't worry, we'll fix this in no time, he said, but there was no confidence in his voice. Alice, tired from the tension, finally made up her mind. John, I'm tired. Call me a taxi, please. I'll go home. Don't say stupid things. Everything will be just fine. I can't just leave the car in the middle of the road, John replied sharply, trying once more to start the vehicle. Alice clearly understood. The breakdown was indeed not accidental. She felt how the strange talisman was beginning to alter the course of events. Of course, it was pointless to talk about it with her husband. He wouldn't believe it anyway. After several minutes of fruitless attempts, John finally admitted defeat. All right, you're right. I'll call you a taxi now, and I'll wait for the tow truck. No matter how you look at it, we definitely won't make it to the notary today. Alice breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, this unpleasant trip was coming to an end. The main thing was that because of the car breakdown, she wouldn't go to the notary and make a will. Suddenly, she remembered Gloria's words and smiled. Settling into the cozy back seat of the taxi, Alice lost herself in memories. Her thoughts drifted back 3 years to when she met John. A slight smile appeared on her face, which she quickly brushed away, as if in doubt about whether she should remember those times. It all started when, returning from the office, she stopped at the window of a jewelry store. Her gaze was drawn to an elegant gold brooch adorned with precious stones. The brooch reminded her of those days when Alice dreamed of a luxurious life, having nothing but desire and boundless energy. Alice couldn't move. At that moment, a young man ran out of the store. 2 security guards with batons in hand were chasing after him. The guy tried to bolt into the park but stumbled, fell, and threw something into the bushes. The guards quickly tackled him. Alice hesitated, not immediately understanding what had happened. She slowly approached the trio, as her curiosity overcame her apprehension about the young man. "What happened?" Alice asked. This crafty one snatched the brooch from the display and tried to make a run for it, one of the security guards replied, keeping his gaze fixed on the young man. He lay on the ground, pinned down by the guards, and despair was frozen in his eyes. To Alice, he didn't seem like a thief at all. "Please, let him go. Let's go into the store, and I'll pay for the item," suggested the young businesswoman. "That's none of your business," replied the guard. "We can tell you're already quite upset." He exchanged glances with his colleague. The guards looked at each other. To be honest, they didn't want to call the police, nor did they want to deal with taking statements and filling out reports. "All right, then pay the fine, including the cost of the stolen brooch." "Although, no, the brooch is in the bushes, we'll take it, and that'll be that." "But you still have to pay the fine." Alice nodded, and after settling the payment with the guards, she approached the frightened young man. "Hey, you're lucky that such a stunning girl took you under her wing," one of the security guards remarked enviously. The hapless thief stood there, sweating from fear. "Are you all right?" Alice asked once the guards left. The man immediately darkened. "I feel bad. My head is spinning. Let me give you a ride home. I'll just call a taxi." "By the way, I'm Alice," she offered. "And I'm John," the man replied shyly. "Nice to meet you. So, shall we go?" Alice smiled and dialed the taxi number. In the car, John sat silently, looking out the window with an indifferent expression. "What made you do that? I mean, what happened?" Alice began. "I don't know, I just couldn't help but take it. It was just so." John shrugged. "But it's illegal. What if they had sent you to jail?" Alice asked, louder than she intended. The taxi driver grimaced and shook his head reproachfully. "Yeah, I know it's illegal, but I couldn't resist." "I have a disease," John said quietly. "A disease?" Alice asked, surprised. "Yeah, you see, it's an internal urge," he confessed sadly. Alice was in shock. "And how do you live with this?" "With difficulty. It feels like I'm sitting on a powder keg, constantly afraid that I'll get caught." "And who else knows about your disease?" Alice asked cautiously. "Almost nobody. I'm very ashamed of it," John admitted, looking away. "You're not a thief, you're just sick. And sick people need treatment, not prison," Alice countered. "Do you think I can be cured?" John asked hopefully, while the taxi driver scoffed in disbelief. "Of course, I have no doubt about it." "Do you want me to help you?" she replied confidently. And how will you do that? Are you going to hit my hands and tell me not to do it? John was surprised. Why be so categorical? We'll find you a good specialist, Alice smiled. John coughed awkwardly, not knowing what to say. Alice hesitated for a moment, then wrote down his phone number. Soon, the taxi driver stopped in front of John's house. Goodbye, Alice. Thank you for everything, he said as he got out of the car. Bye. Take care and don't get caught again. I'll call you in a few days, Alice called after him. It took the young businesswoman a week to find the right specialist. John's case was very complicated since his mother had never sought medical help or tried to assist her son. However, Alice had her own perspective on the situation. After discussing the details with the doctor, she immediately called her new acquaintance. John, hi. I found a specialist. He has a solid practice, and trust me, he will help, Alice said confidently. You have no idea how grateful I am to you. John exclaimed joyfully. Don't mention it. How are you doing overall? Alice asked with a smile. Not great. My mother found out about the incident. And she's against the treatment, John sighed. And what did she say? Alice asked, feeling her heart tighten. She's furious. She says I'm a disgrace and that this treatment is a waste of time, he replied sadly. Well, she's just worried about you, like any mother. Believe me, she cares, Alice countered. Despite everything, John decided to see the specialist. Eventually, the girl's assumptions were confirmed. Therapy with the psychologist yielded results. John truly managed to overcome his urge to steal and stopped risking his freedom every day. Perhaps, if Alice hadn't come into his life at that moment, he would have ended up in prison. But Alice helped him through the toughest time of his life. However, his mother, Mindy, took an instant dislike to Alice. Perhaps she was put off by the self-assuredness of her future daughter-in-law, who was used to relying on herself and never expected help from others. In her just over 50 years, Mindy had achieved practically nothing. Working as a hairdresser in a beauty salon, she watched the wealthy clients she had to serve with envy. Not a day went by without Mindy imagining herself in their place. However, she did almost nothing to change her situation. When her son introduced her to Alice, Mindy immediately decided that her daughter-in-law had achieved everything solely because of her parents. Well, it's easy to be a rich heiress, the mother-in-law sneered. But Mindy had no idea how mistaken she was. Everything Alice had accomplished, she had done herself. She didn't remember her father, and her mother passed away 2 years before Alice achieved success. In Mindy's eyes, her future daughter-in-law appeared like a sweet treat that a lucky groom must claim. Mindy quickly pointed out to John that Alice had no other relatives besides a potential husband or fiancé. Listen, John, don't waste any time. Start guarding this little simpleton, she remarked with a smirk. I see her business is well established. And you know how it goes. Before you know it, you'll take her place, Mindy said one time. Initially, John didn't take his mother's words seriously. Despite his economics degree, he still hadn't found a job and didn't know how to apply his knowledge. His main problems were inconsistency and irresponsibility. He could easily sleep until noon and show up at the office in the middle of the workday. Naturally, no employer wanted to put up with that and would point to the door after just a couple of days. His mother understood this and never judged him. In her dreams, she imagined him as a prominent businessman who had acquired a fortune. What's wrong with that? Why is it acceptable for women to marry rich men, but men can't choose wealthy brides? Mindy would say during heartfelt conversations with her son. Perhaps if it weren't for his mother's influence, John would have grown into a completely different person. But he had been used to being coddled since childhood. Alice realized too late that she had tied her life to the wrong person, and this became clear only when doctors diagnosed her with a serious illness. Initially, they avoided answers, looked away, and gave vague explanations to her questions. But then, when it became clear that the condition was much more serious than expected, they told her directly that her life was hanging by a thread. Upon learning this, Mindy was ready to clap her hands. This was her chance, the one she had dreamed of for many years. "Listen, son, I'll say this once," she began, looking intently at John. "We've reached a time when you need to show all your cleverness and ability to pretend. You need to convince Alice to make a will in your favor. Can't you see she doesn't have long to live, and after her death, you will become the sole owner of her empire," Mindy said significantly. John looked at his mother doubtfully. "Come on, it feels wrong. What if she gets better? I think we should wait a bit longer to be sure." Mindy smirked. "No, son. We need to do everything now while she's of sound mind. Otherwise, some distant relative might come along, contest the will, and claim your wife was not in her right state of mind." A flicker of understanding crossed John's eyes. He had always listened to his mother, who did everything to ensure that the little fool had everything, while he got nothing in return. Now, sitting in the taxi and recalling this, Alice couldn't hold back her tears. She was the one who had gifted her mother-in-law the beauty salon, where she became the owner. Alice simply approached the previous owner, offered an amount she couldn't refuse, and handed the salon over to her mother-in-law, doing this just in time for her anniversary. Alice presented her mother-in-law with a gift on a silver platter, a sign with the golden numbers 55 and the name of the beauty salon, into which Mindy entered as the rightful owner. At that moment, the cunning woman realized that her son should experience the same feelings: wealth, success, and power. In the event of his wife's death, John would become the heir to a large business. The thought that Alice could survive or that treatment might yield positive results never crossed Mindy's mind. She had long been searching for a way to approach Alice's doctors to discuss a very delicate matter. Of course, there was no talk of any crime. Mindy's plan was much more cunning. She intended to bribe the leading specialist to implant the idea of Alice's impending death into the patient's mind. This was not only meant to strip Alice of hope, but also to nudge her toward the thought of drafting a will in favor of John. Therefore, John ostentatiously took his wife to the cemetery so she could pick a spot. He achieved his goal. Alice was in despair, and thoughts of the future were unbearable for her. However, Alice's illness was not as critical as the bribed doctor claimed. Dr. Dean, once a respected figure, had fallen into a debt pit due to his gambling addiction. Upon learning this, Mindy realized she had found his weak spot. She entered the doctor's office, locked the door, and, glancing around, handed him a thick bundle of cash that not only covered his debts, but also allowed him to gamble again. "I think we understand each other?" Mindy asked with a smile. The doctor blushed and nodded, indicating that he was ready to help. From that day on, Alice's diagnosis came with several alarming entries, and the doctor persistently hinted at a deterioration in her condition. All this affected Alice's psyche and hindered her focus on work. The business began to suffer, and John immediately offered his services to manage the company, assuring his wife that she could now concentrate on her treatment. Thus, John took the position of the company's director and soon realized that he didn't want to leave that chair. He was determined to cement himself in this role forever. To hasten Alice's end, he secretly swapped her medications for ordinary vitamins that had no therapeutic effect. Such a simple yet ruthless plan allowed Mindy and her son to confidently move toward their goal without fearing any resistance. Alice, without that treatment, will get worse and worse every day. And with bribery, the doctor will be able to maintain his reputation and clean hands. If only Alice could know what kind of snake she has sheltered, one who has suffered because of an irresistible urge to steal. It's no wonder that people say only the grave can correct a person. This example was particularly apt for John, who now, instead of shoplifting, was robbing his innocent wife. Taking advantage of his impunity and freedom, Alice had to listen to tales about how business problems were overwhelming him and how competitors were becoming bolder every day. Unfortunately, there was no one to help her. It was as if she had fallen into a pool of piranhas, with no allies on her side. Perhaps if she had relatives, even distant ones, Alice could have salvaged her precarious situation. But since everything was spiraling into the abyss because of John and his mother, she could do nothing. Her sad reflections were interrupted by the voice of the taxi driver. "Well, here we are. Do you need help? You look a bit pale. You might just faint." Alice wearily shook her head. "No, it's fine. Really, I can manage. Everything's okay." Saying this, she stumbled out of the car and, just a second later, experienced a severe bout of dizziness. If it weren't for the quick-witted taxi driver nearby, she might have fallen. The taxi driver approached the door and persistently pressed the doorbell a couple of times. She opened the door to see her unconscious daughter-in-law in the arms of a stranger and wrinkled her nose in disgust, stepping aside. "Well, here we go. What, did she get drunk or something?" This had never happened to Alice before. She had never fainted in public. The taxi driver looked at the mother-in-law in surprise. "Excuse me, but I think you need to call an ambulance as soon as possible. The woman is unwell, and she clearly hasn't been drinking." Mindy looked at the driver indignantly. "Listen here, buddy. You should just leave. I'll handle my daughter-in-law myself. She's been sick for 3 months, and I've long gotten used to all her whims. She's just trying to attract attention so people pity her and carry her around. So you can just go ahead, you brought her, and that's enough. I won't keep you any longer." For some inexplicable reason, the taxi driver didn't want to leave. He saw that Alice needed help, and considering the mother-in-law's reaction, he could be sure that the unfortunate woman would get no support today. The driver thought for a moment and then said, "You know, I think I'll call an ambulance myself." Mindy's eyebrows slowly rose. "What do you think you're doing, puppy? I'll call your boss right now and tell them such things that you'll never forget me. Tell me, do you need problems right now? That's right, you don't. So get out of here before something happens and deal with your daughter-in-law yourself. I said I'll handle it." As if a good Samaritan had suddenly appeared. It was clear from the taxi driver's eyes that the mother-in-law's threats hadn't affected him. Pulling out his smartphone from his pocket, he quickly dialed a number and described the situation in detail while Mindy watched. "Call accepted. Please wait," came a confident voice from the receiver. Understanding that she wouldn't be able to shake off the pesky taxi driver, Mindy began to look for the phone numbers of those who could influence him. However, in her haste, she didn't have time to do so. Soon, there was a knock at the door. At the doorstep stood an ambulance paramedic along with his assistant. Seeing the unconscious body of the young woman, he immediately got to work. He checked her pulse, measured her blood pressure, and then quickly questioned Mindy, who, although she didn't want to tell the truth, ultimately spoke up, fearing criminal responsibility. It was one thing to deceive her unsuspecting daughter-in-law, and quite another to lie to emergency medical staff who could easily report to law enforcement. If that happened, a very unpleasant interrogation awaited her and her son at the police station. During all this time, the taxi driver stood aside, unsure of what to do next. His name was Gregory, and he had been working in the taxi service for about 6 months. Overall, he liked his job, mainly because he could spend all day driving his favorite car. Gregory had taken the taxi job under the following conditions. He would drive only his own car and, in exchange, would take any orders given by the dispatcher. In general, this practice was widespread in private transportation companies, and nothing prevented Gregory from doing what he loved. After examining Alice, the paramedic asked, "Please provide your phone number or any other contact details. Gather some personal belongings for the time being." Mindy froze in surprise. "How can you hospitalize her in a private clinic? Her treating doctor should be monitoring her." "It doesn't matter to you." The paramedic frowned and looked at Mindy with the same expression an elderly teacher uses on a student who has flunked an exam. "Regardless of where the patient was treated, she is in critical condition, which is life-threatening and requires urgent hospitalization, and I bear full responsibility." "Understood. So don't interfere, and better help." Red spots appeared on Mindy's cheeks. "Listen, I'm going to complain to your supervisor. And I will also write a refusal of hospitalization." The paramedic shook his head negatively. "No, you cannot refuse in this case. I cannot take that responsibility. If you feel like complaining, God be your judge. But I can't oppose this. I can even give you the contact information for the station supervisor. You can tell him everything that happened here. Meanwhile, we are taking the patient to the department." Realizing that she couldn't handle the situation, Mindy began calling her son. But, of course, he didn't pick up, as he was busy with his SUV, which was in for repairs at the auto shop. Thus, due to a chain of unfortunate events, Alice finally ended up in a medical facility where her treatment was approached with full responsibility. This was because a completely different doctor, not a bribed trader seeking money from Mindy for another card game, was now taking care of her. After being admitted to the intensive care unit, Alice was immediately placed under observation, which did not allow anyone to see her, not even her closest relatives. John only learned what had happened in the evening when he saw his mother's tear-stained face. But Mindy was not crying out of concern for her daughter-in-law. She was afraid that the deception would be revealed, and they would end up in court. Of course, he understood the danger that hospitalization posed. But on the other hand, perhaps things were nearing an end, and even the ICU wouldn't be able to help Alice. The bad part was that she hadn't had time to write a will, which he had been reminding her about for half the day. In that moment, his consciousness broke through. Why did I even let her out? The moment she left, problems started. First, the car broke down, and now look, Alice is in intensive care. Of course, it was foolish to hope that John would ever run into that old woman in town. Most likely, due to her age, she rarely left the house and was probably spending her days in front of the TV with a ball of yarn in her hands. But John didn't even suspect how wrong he was. Gloria was indeed a third-generation fortune teller, but as strange as it sounded, she had spent about 40 years of her life working as a paramedic. It just happened that her predictive ability had only emerged in her later years, after she retired. That was when Gloria realized that she could bring value to people, warning them of danger or giving valuable advice for the future. It was also noteworthy that she didn't charge a penny for her services, even though many offered her good money for helping them with their business or warning them about failing deals. Gloria herself was convinced that if she took even a penny, her gift would no longer be a divine blessing, but would turn into a soulless tool for making money. Naturally, she could not allow herself to do that. Also, Gloria, who had no children of her own, had a nephew, Luis, working at the ambulance station, who was considered one of the best paramedics in the area. He often visited his beloved aunt to share the latest news and check on her health. This was the case today as well, when, after a long shift, Louise came by with a bag of groceries and a bundle of medicines. "Here comes Louise. I've been waiting for you," she said, peering out the window and noticing he was not there. "I thought you had forgotten," she added with a smile. Louise smiled back. "Oh, come on, how could I? You were like a mother to me today." She paused, then added, "But I had a tough patient to transport to the ICU. And before that, there was a scandal with her mother-in-law. She flat out refused hospitalization and even yelled that she would complain. People these days." "Yeah, it happens," Gloria shook her head. "Louise, don't hold a grudge against her, just do your job. People are different. Sometimes you just can't please everyone." As for why she didn't want to let her go, maybe it's out of great love, out of concern. Though that's very rare in life. Most of the time, mothers-in-law do everything to make their daughters-in-law's lives miserable, and it seems quite strange that the mother-in-law refused hospitalization. Louise grimaced. "Yeah, it really is strange. And they say her husband showed up recently and caused a scene, asking why his wife was taken to the hospital without his knowledge. As if I should have waited for permission to take her. That rich guy acted like everyone owed him something." "What did he look like?" "Well, he had a car. Was it a huge black one?" Gloria asked with interest, feeling she had picked up on an important thread of the conversation. Louise nodded in surprise. "Yeah, a black one, and the driver was short, with a round belly and a look that made you not want to look at him." Gloria went pale. At that moment, the elderly fortune teller had a sixth sense that told her they were probably talking about the same woman she had warned about this morning near the city cemetery. Gloria had gone there to visit her husband, whom she had buried 10 years ago. Since then, she had lived in complete solitude, aside from a cat and a hamster living in a small cozy cage. In the beginning, the cat constantly tried to catch the lazily sleeping hamster, but it would just roll over with a proud look and fall back asleep. Over time, the cat got used to it, no longer paying attention to the external irritants. After listening to her nephew's story, Gloria pondered for a moment, then said, "Listen, Louise, could you arrange a meeting for me with that woman? Well, you could just escort me to the intensive care unit. After all, I used to work there. If necessary, I can even pull out my awards or my honorary donor ID." Louise just waved his hand. "Come on, you don't need all that. I'll just escort you. Besides, many people probably remember you. They won't mind if you meet with this woman. They say the only close relatives she has are her husband and mother-in-law. But if that's really the case, she's not in for anything good." Gloria nodded in agreement, understanding that she absolutely needed to see Alice, whom she had managed to warn, but misfortune had still befallen her. At that moment, she and her mother spent the whole evening thinking about what to do next. The son, due to his cowardly nature, suggested moving to another city to lay low for a while, saying that if Alice died, they would find out about it from the newspaper or the local news broadcast. And if she survives, she'll call him herself and explain everything, Mindy thought, but that option did not suit her at all. She already anticipated the whole situation, realizing that the issue with her daughter-in-law needed to be resolved in a very short time. For this reason, Mindy decided to take another approach and asked her son to get her a medical gown and cap. "Mom, why do you need that? Are you going to work?" "You have a beauty salon, everyone works for you there," John asked. But her mother only responded mysteriously, pressing her finger to her lips. While they passionately wished for a departure to the other world, Alice was in a coma, in that very state where days fly by like seconds, and weeks hardly equal 1 minute. Late in the evening, Mindy called Alice's former doctor, Dean. "Alice, there's been a disaster. I need your help. Tomorrow, right after lunch, let me into her room. Pass me off as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs employee. I'll put on the gown, slippers, and cap, everything as it should be." The doctor flinched. "Why do you need that?" "That's my business. If you refuse, I'll quickly remind you of all your debts and show you the recording I made to protect myself from all sorts of surprises. So I wouldn't advise you to deceive me. It's better to take me to my daughter-in-law's room, and I'll figure out what to do from there," Mindy said in one breath. After her words, Dean felt uneasy. He least expected everything to end this way, on such a major note. "Fine, I'll be waiting for you at the clinic entrance tomorrow," the doctor replied curtly and hung up. Naturally, he understood that Mindy was plotting something not very good, but he didn't want to resist, especially considering the compromising information in the hands of his mother-in-law. Dean had long realized he was hooked by Mindy, and now he could only dance to her tune to avoid ending up behind bars, discussing matters through barbed wire. Mindy awaited the morning with great impatience. She had already thought through several scenarios in her mind, ranging from the banal disconnection of Alice from life support to an intramuscular injection of a drug that would lead to cardiac arrest. Of course, Mindy understood the risk she was taking, but the game was worth the candle. She knew that under the pressure of irrefutable evidence, the doctor would confess everything as if in confession, for no one wanted to spend their remaining days behind bars, eating prison slop and gazing mournfully at the dim light bulb in the ceiling. The plan was simple: infiltrate Alice's room and carry out her intentions. At first, everything went smoothly. The bribery, as intended, worked. The doctor led them toward the intensive care unit while appreciating the creativity of his companion, who had already changed into medical scrubs and was planning to pass herself off as a nurse to gain entry. On one hand, this was advantageous for Dean, as a successful operation would keep his reputation impeccable. The closer Mindy got to her daughter-in-law's room, the harder her heart raced and her palms grew sweaty. A syringe hidden in her sleeve, her eyes sparkled with feverish excitement as she imagined that in just a minute she would finally be rid of her hated daughter-in-law. Pulling the door handle, the mother-in-law caught herself thinking that courage and determination would conquer any difficulties. She was about to enter the room and do what she had been preparing for all evening. Alice lay motionless, her frail body's life supported only by various medical devices with numerous buttons and sensors. A smile played on the mother-in-law's lips, feeling the situation was practically under her control. Deciding to try the first option from her list, Mindy attempted to disconnect the equipment. But as soon as she touched one of the tubes, the door to the room swung open, and an elderly woman around 70 appeared behind her, speaking angrily. "What are you doing?" "There's no need to pretend to be a nurse. I know everything. I worked for 40 years at the ambulance station. So keep your tricks for amateurs." She stepped aside, quickly commanding the elderly woman, realizing that it was all over. Mindy dropped the syringe from her hands. At that moment, behind Gloria, a tall figure emerged, her nephew Luis, who immediately jumped to Alice and shielded her with his body. Mindy covered her face with her hands and quietly began to cry. But her tears had no effect on either Luis or Gloria. Soon, the resuscitation doctor entered the room, and after a brief conversation with Luis, he called the police without further questions. On the same day, John and the despicable doctor were arrested. In a hurry, they began to give confessions, but deceiving the law enforcement was not as easy as they had thought. Experienced detectives quickly identified who was who in this criminal trio. Naturally, no one was able to escape punishment. After spending about a month in the investigative detention center, Mindy asked to be interrogated, where she began to vilify Dean, blaming him for dragging her into this adventure. The investigators had anticipated such a turn of events and were prepared for all sorts of surprises. Alice's condition had noticeably improved. This was partly due to the fact that she finally received the necessary qualified help from those genuinely interested in treating patients rather than extorting money. As it turned out during repeat tests, Alice showed signs of stable remission, which gave her hope for a swift recovery. She herself didn't understand how this was possible until Gloria entered her room. Everything became clear without words. The amulet given to her by the elderly fortune teller still rested in the pocket of her coat, proving beneficial to its owner. After Alice regained consciousness, Gloria visited her almost every day. However, she didn't go for walks but drove there with her nephew, spending several hours in the room. Gloria shared stories about her life and reassured Alice that there was no need to fear illness. One should fight to the end in any situation. Alice listened and couldn't believe her ears. But could such coincidences really exist? Was it possible that on the same day she met Gloria first, and then her nephew Luis? Of course, the moment she met the doctor, who informed her that her husband wanted to get rid of her, Alice was once again amazed at the twists of fate. Alice was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks later after spending time in the intensive care unit. The young businesswoman's condition was assessed by doctors as stable and good, causing no further concern. Gloria and Luis were waiting for her at the clinic doors, with Luis even taking a day off for this occasion. The young man held a sweet smile. "Here's something for you. Congratulations on your recovery. Don't get sick again." Luis mumbled, half embarrassed, lowering his gaze. As it turned out, during the time they spent together, Alice had developed friendly feelings for Luis and now wanted to see him by her side always. Just like Gloria, whom Alice now referred to as Mom, considering her a guardian angel,